There's a tunnel in Ontario where people light a match, watch it go out on its own, and then hear something that sounds like a scream coming from deeper inside. A few hours north, there's a stretch of highway where people have gone missing without a trace, even after full search efforts. And in a quiet farming area near Wallaceburg, settlers once reported fires starting inside their homes for no reason at all, until someone stepped in and performed what they believed was an exorcism. Ontario isn't supposed to have places like this. It's known for quiet towns, lakes, and long highways where nothing really happens. But scattered across the province are places where something did happen, and whatever caused it was never fully explained. These aren't ghost tours or made-up legends built for tourists. These are real towns, real locations, with details that don't sit right once you look into them. Some were abandoned, some never recovered, and a few are still there, operating like nothing is wrong, even though the stories tied to them say otherwise. We're going through 10 towns in Ontario where something doesn't quite add up. Places with unexplained events, violent history, dangerous ground beneath them, or environments where people disappear and aren't found. If you've only seen Ontario from the surface, you've missed most of it. Number 10. Niagara Falls, Ontario.
The tunnel no one stays in for long.
Just outside the main Niagara Falls tourist strip, a few minutes from Clifton Hill and the Horseshoe Falls area, there's a narrow brick passage near Warner Road known locally as the Screaming Tunnel. It runs beneath an old railway line, and during the day, it barely stands out. The structure is narrow, built from dark brick, with moisture clinging to the walls, and just enough light passing through from either end to make it feel safe enough to walk through without thinking twice. At night, the atmosphere shifts. Sound carries differently inside the tunnel, stretching just enough to feel off. Footsteps echo longer than expected, and once you reach the center, both exits seem farther away than they should, even though you just walked in. Nothing physically changes, but the space stops feeling neutral. The story attached to it has been repeated for decades, with only small variations depending on who tells it. A house once stood nearby, and one night it caught fire. A young girl inside either couldn't escape or made it out too late, running toward the tunnel while she was still on fire before collapsing just short of the other side. What keeps people coming back isn't the story itself, it's what they think happens inside. Visitors go in after dark, usually in groups at first, carrying a lighter or a match. The idea is simple enough: stand in the middle, light the flame, and wait. Some say the flame goes out on its own, even when the air feels still. Others describe hearing something after a few seconds, not loud or clear, but enough to resemble a scream coming from somewhere deeper in the tunnel before it cuts off completely. No one agrees on exactly what they hear, but very few stay long enough to figure it out. There's nothing physically stopping anyone from walking straight through and leaving, and that's part of what makes it work. The moment you stop moving and stand still, the silence settles in a way that doesn't feel natural, and the longer you wait, the more it feels like you're standing somewhere you shouldn't be. Niagara Falls is built around constant movement, water, crowds, noise, and light. This tunnel sits completely outside of that rhythm, holding onto something that doesn't match the rest of the city. Number 9. Wallaceburg, Ontario.
The settlement where fires wouldn't stop.
In the early 1800s, settlers moved into an area near what is now Wallaceburg, in southwestern Ontario, along the Sydenham River, establishing a farming community known as the Baldoon Settlement. It followed the same pattern as most early communities in the region, with land cleared, homes built, and families trying to create something stable in an unfamiliar environment. For a while, everything appeared normal. The disturbances started gradually, in ways that were easy to dismiss at first. Tools went missing and later turned up in different locations. Household objects were found out of place, without explanation. Livestock became difficult to manage, behaving unpredictably even when conditions were calm. It didn't take long for those events to escalate. Fires started breaking out in homes, often in areas where no obvious source could be found. Furniture would ignite without warning. Sections of walls caught fire in ways that didn't match how fire normally spreads. Families put out the flames, repaired what they could, and then watched it happen again. Witness accounts describe objects being thrown across rooms without anyone touching them. Stones striking buildings from no clear direction. Movement that couldn't be traced back to a person or an animal. The incidents were consistent enough that multiple families reported similar experiences over time, which made it harder to dismiss them as isolated exaggerations. Attempts were made to explain it in practical terms. Neighbors were suspected. Outsiders were blamed. Some believed it was deliberate sabotage designed to drive settlers away from the land. But the fires continued. Eventually, the situation escalated to the point where religious intervention was requested. A minister was brought in to address what many residents had started to describe as something beyond physical explanation, and an exorcism was performed on the property. According to the records that remain, the activity stopped shortly after. No definitive explanation was ever agreed upon. The settlement eventually declined, like many others, but the story stayed attached to the land in a way that typical pioneer hardships did not. Today, the area looks quiet. Fields, roads, farmland that doesn't suggest anything unusual at first glance. That's what makes it harder to place. You're left with the knowledge that something happened there, witnessed by multiple people who had no shared explanation and no physical trace that clearly confirms or denies it now. Number 8. Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario.
The town that burned and never fully moved on.
Niagara-on-the-Lake, particularly along Queen's Parade near Fort George and the historic downtown core, looks almost staged when you first see it. The streets are clean, the buildings are carefully preserved, and everything about it feels intentional, down to the painted trim, the maintained brickwork, and the way storefronts and homes seem arranged rather than naturally evolved over time, like the town is presenting a version of itself that has been carefully controlled. But the history here wasn't calm. During the War of 1812, this town, then known as Newark, became a central point of conflict. It was burned to the ground by American forces in 1813, forcing residents to flee in the middle of winter while soldiers moved through what was left behind. The destruction wasn't partial or symbolic. Entire sections were wiped out. Homes, storage buildings, gathering spaces, and people who stayed behind didn't all survive, either because they couldn't leave in time or because there was nowhere left to go. What stands today was rebuilt on top of that. Fort George, just outside the town center, carries most of the weight of that history. The site has seen repeated reports of unexplained activity over the years, from footsteps in empty rooms to doors moving on their own, and voices heard when no one else is present. Staff and visitors describe similar experiences, even when they arrive with no expectation of anything unusual, with some noting that the sounds feel directional, as if someone is moving through the building rather than random noise. During the day, it functions like a destination. Restaurants are busy, tourists move through the streets, and everything feels controlled. At night, when that movement fades, the environment changes. The same buildings feel heavier, and the quiet stretches further than expected, with gaps between sounds that feel longer than they should. The history isn't hidden or exaggerated, it's preserved, and that preservation keeps it close enough that it never fully settles into the past. Number 7. Cobalt, Ontario.
The town built on ground that never stabilized.
Cobalt, particularly around Silver Street and the surrounding hills, where the earliest mining operations took place, was established after a major silver discovery in the early 1900s, and within a short period of time, it became one of the most important mining centers in North America. The town expanded quickly, driven by demand, investment, and the assumption that the resources beneath it would support long-term growth, with new structures going up rapidly and little time spent considering long-term stability. To access that silver, hundreds of mine shafts were dug. Some were documented carefully. Others were created quickly, without long-term planning, as companies focused on extraction rather than what would happen after, leaving behind vertical drops, unstable openings, and tunnels that extended outward in ways that weren't always tracked properly. The result was an extensive network of underground workings that extended far beyond what was visible from the surface. When production declined, many of those shafts were abandoned. They weren't all sealed. Some were covered, others were left exposed or partially hidden over time as vegetation grew around them, creating areas where what looks like solid ground is actually thin surface, covering empty space below. The landscape changed, but the underlying structure remained. That's what makes parts of Cobalt unsettling. You can walk through areas that appear stable, with houses, roads, and open land, without realizing how much of it sits above old mining activity. Over the years, there have been incidents where people encountered openings they didn't expect, or where the ground itself wasn't as reliable as it looked, shifting or giving way without warning. The risk isn't always obvious. That creates a different kind of tension, because nothing about the town signals danger immediately. It feels quiet, even stable, until you understand what exists beneath it and how much of that was never fully secured. Cobalt didn't disappear after the boom. It stayed, and that means everything built during that time is still part of it. Number 6. Lucan, Ontario.
The night no one was held responsible.
Near Lucan, along Roman line where the Donnelly homestead once stood, the landscape looks like any other stretch of rural southwestern Ontario. Open farmland, long uninterrupted sight lines, and quiet roads where you can drive for several minutes without seeing another vehicle, giving no indication that anything significant ever happened there. In 1880, that changed. The Donnelly family had been involved in long-standing disputes with others in the area, with tensions building over time through conflicts that never fully resolved, arguments escalating into physical confrontations and divisions forming within the community that extended beyond a single household. One night, a group of men surrounded the Donnelly home. They set it on fire and waited outside as the family tried to escape. One by one, those who came out were attacked and killed, while the fire continued to spread through the structure, trapping others inside and ensuring there was no way out. The violence was direct and coordinated. Afterward, several individuals were arrested and brought to trial. The case appeared straightforward, with known suspects and a clear sequence of events. But when the time came for witnesses to testify, many refused or claimed they hadn't seen enough to identify those responsible, despite the scale of what had happened. Without testimony, the case collapsed. No one was convicted. The site where the house once stood still exists, and while it doesn't draw attention during the day, it's become a place people return to after dark, usually without saying exactly why. Some claim that once you stop moving, the area feels different, like the space around you is being watched from somewhere just beyond what you can see. Others describe how the sound carries oddly across the open fields, footsteps, wind, even distant movement, seeming closer than it should be. A few have said they heard something shift in the darkness, not clearly enough to identify, but enough to make them leave without checking. None of these experiences are consistent, and there's nothing you can point to as proof. But most people who go there at night don't stay long enough to question it. An entire family was killed, the attackers were known, and the legal system never delivered a resolution. That lack of closure is what keeps the story from settling, because the event itself isn't unclear, only the outcome is. Number 5. Orillia, Ontario.
The buildings that were left empty for a reason.
Just outside Orillia, along Memorial Avenue where the Huronia Regional Center once operated, the institution stood for decades as a facility for individuals with developmental disabilities. It was built with the intention of providing care, but over time, reports began to surface, describing conditions that fell far short of that goal, with accounts pointing to systemic issues rather than isolated failures. Investigations later revealed patterns of neglect, overcrowding, and abuse that had gone unaddressed for years, affecting large numbers of residents and shaping the reputation of the facility long before it was publicly acknowledged. When the facility closed, the buildings remained. For a period of time, the site sat empty, with multiple structures left intact. Windows broke, interiors deteriorated, and sections of the property were left exposed to the elements, with some rooms still containing remnants of their previous use, while others had been stripped down completely. Those who entered the site after it was abandoned described an atmosphere that felt unusually heavy, even without knowing the full history behind it, with long stretches of silence that didn't feel empty so much as contained, as if the space still held on to what had happened there. The layout contributed to that feeling. Long hallways, large rooms, and sections that were designed for control rather than comfort created an environment that felt restrictive even without anyone present, with sightlines that extended too far and corners that limited visibility just enough to make movement feel uncertain. Eventually, most of the buildings were demolished. What remains is the record of what took place there, documented through investigations and testimonies that surfaced after the facility closed. Places like this don't rely on speculation. The history is already enough. Number 4. Pickle Lake, Ontario.
The point where the road stops solving problems.
Driving north along Highway 599 toward Pickle Lake, the landscape gradually shifts from scattered towns to long stretches of uninterrupted forest, with fewer signs of infrastructure as you continue, fewer side roads, fewer buildings, and longer distances between any kind of service. By the time you reach Pickle Lake, it's clear that this is the northernmost point in Ontario accessible by highway. Beyond this point, travel becomes conditional. Air routes replace roads, and movement depends on factors that can't always be controlled, with weather delays, limited access, and conditions that can change quickly without much warning. That changes how the area feels. Driving into the town, the sense of isolation is already established, and once you look beyond it, the surrounding landscape doesn't gradually transition. It opens directly into wilderness, with dense forest and water systems stretching out without clear boundaries. If something goes wrong beyond that point, response times aren't immediate. Search efforts in northern Ontario face terrain that slows everything down. Dense forest, water systems, and distances that expand quickly once you leave the main road, making it difficult to track movement or narrow down locations. People have gone missing in these areas. Sometimes they're found, sometimes they're not. Pickle Lake doesn't create that risk. It marks where it begins. Number 3. Sudbury, Ontario.
The landscape that showed what industry can do.
In Sudbury, particularly around Falcon Bridge Road and the older industrial outskirts where mining and smelting operations were concentrated, the surrounding landscape didn't always resemble what it does today. For decades, those operations altered the environment to the point where large areas were stripped of vegetation and left with exposed rock and damaged soil. The scale of that impact was visible. At one point, the region was described as having a barren appearance. At its worst, parts of Sudbury were described as looking like a moonscape, not just damaged, but stripped to the point where the land didn't resemble anything natural. The soil had been burned out by decades of sulfur emissions, leaving behind blackened rock, no vegetation, and air that carried a constant industrial residue. The comparison wasn't just visual either. NASA used sections of the region to train astronauts because the terrain closely matched what they expected to see on the moon. Standing in those areas at the time meant being surrounded by land that no longer supported life in any visible way. No trees, no growth, just exposed rock stretching outward in every direction. Efforts have since been made to restore those areas, and much of the landscape has recovered, but traces of that damage still exist. Old industrial zones, abandoned structures, and areas that were heavily affected during peak operations remain part of the region, sitting alongside restored sections in a way that creates a visible contrast. These locations don't always draw attention. They sit alongside areas that have been restored, creating a contrast between what the land was and what it became. And in some places, that contrast is noticeable enough to feel out of place. The history is still visible, even if it's not as obvious as it used to be. Number 2. North Bay, Ontario.
The stretch where distance becomes a factor.
North Bay, positioned along Highway 11, where the transition into northern Ontario becomes more pronounced, sits at a point where distances between communities begin to stretch out significantly, with long sections of road extending through dense forest and limited development. Beyond this area, highways run through terrain that doesn't offer many visual markers, with tree cover reducing visibility and making it difficult to track movement once someone leaves the main road. That changes how incidents are handled. In one case, a driver pulled over along Highway 11 just outside North Bay, stepped away from the vehicle, and never made it back. The car was found where it had been left, keys still inside, no signs of a struggle, and no clear indication of where the person had gone. Search teams covered the surrounding area, moving through dense forest and uneven ground, but the terrain made it difficult to establish any direction of travel. With no clear trail and too much ground to cover, the search eventually stalled, without a definitive answer. When people go missing in these areas, search efforts have to account for terrain that can slow progress significantly, with large areas to cover and limited reference points to guide direction. Over the years, there have been cases where individuals disappeared in these regions and were not located despite extensive searches. The environment plays a role in that outcome. Once someone moves beyond the main road network, it becomes much harder to track direction or establish a clear path. Distances that seem manageable can expand quickly, and the terrain doesn't provide many clear markers. The highway itself doesn't feel unusual. It's what exists beyond it that creates the uncertainty. Number 1. Canora, Ontario.
Where the scale works against you.
Near Canora, along the shoreline of Lake of the Woods and extending out through areas like Norman Island, Keewatin Channel, and the countless unnamed islands scattered across the region, the landscape shifts from something that looks manageable into something much harder to fully understand. From shore, the water appears calm, broken only by small land formations and narrow channels that seem easy to navigate. Once you're out on it, the scale changes everything. Lake of the Woods isn't a single open body of water. It's a network that spreads across thousands of square kilometers, with over 14,000 islands, hidden passages, and long stretches where visibility depends entirely on where you're positioned. What looks like a clear route from one angle can close off from another, and distances that seem short from land can take far longer to cross than expected. That complexity affects what happens when something goes wrong. Boats capsize, engines fail, weather shifts quickly, and people who head out alone don't always return. In some cases, there's no immediate signal that anything has happened at all, just an absence where someone was expected to be. Search efforts begin with limited information, often covering large areas with no clear starting point beyond a last known location that may already be outdated. Water movement, depth, and the number of possible routes all work against those searches. Even when teams know where to look, the scale makes it difficult to narrow anything down quickly. Time becomes a factor, and once enough of it passes, the chances of finding anything decrease. Canora itself feels stable. The shoreline, the town, the access points all suggest something contained and understandable. But the moment you move out onto the lake, that sense of control drops away, replaced by an environment that doesn't offer many second chances once something shifts. That's what makes it unsettling. Not what you can see from land, but how much exists beyond it that you can't fully track once you're in the middle of it. Ontario isn't defined by these places, but they exist within it, scattered across the province, in ways that aren't always obvious until you start looking for them. Most people pass through these areas without noticing anything unusual. That doesn't mean there isn't anything there. It just means you have to know where to look. If you want to see more, make sure you like and subscribe. We post facts about towns across North America each week.